There we go. Oh shit! Mistakes were made. Okay. Fine, it's time to ramble about some random things. So time passes by fast. Yoink. Vídeo novo. There we go. Can I not? Hello? Okay. Fine by me. No, wrong one.
Aqui estão os camaradas do canal Hipócritas, jubilantes de felicidade por estarem juntos a um corrupto, condenado, mensaleiro, o senhor Roberto Jefferson, que virou o mito da direita vendida. Né? Sérgio Moro virou comunista e Roberto Jefferson virou o mito da direita vendida, que eles estão absolutamente jubilantes de alegria por estarem do lado desta grande celebridade.
Coronel Caralho!
É isso aí! O gordinho aqui ele só falta ficar louco, ó, de tanto... Aqui as tetinhas chegam até a pular de felicidade. Mas que delícia, hein, Papai Noel, como diria...
Menino espertinho.
Este é o humor que rasteja. Este é o humor de cabresto, este é o humor de coleira. Cadê que vocês veem no canal desses caras uma crítica, por mais adocicada que seja, ao mito? Porque o poder fascina. São como mariposas, né, que vão até a lâmpada e ficam se debatendo nela, cegas, completamente cegas, se debatendo lá. Se decepção matasse, eu estaria morto de ter recomendado esses caras aqui, de ter ajudado o canal desses vendidos, né, desses prostitutos da consciência ter prosperado. Hoje nós vamos falar a respeito desses hipócritas todos, da anulação, da quebra de sigilo de Flavinho Wonka, que vai andar livre, leve e solto, e da PEC da impunidade que está sendo perpetrada pelo senhor Arthur Lira, aquele que enforcou a própria mulher, que é réu 2 vezes, que é o candidato, foi o candidato do mito para a presidência da Câmara, e que vai fazer reinar a impunidade. Quem votou a favor disso? O próprio Bananinha. Nós vamos falar a respeito de todas essas coisas aqui, desses hipócritas desgraçados. Mas antes eu peço você, verifique a sua inscrição. Mesmo quando esses caras vendiam uma cortina de fumaça, uma realidade diferente, uma ginástica mental onde o mito sempre está certo. Uma realidade de farsa. Eu agradeço muito a você que permaneceu aqui no canal. Tá? Você que não se deixou encantar pela mentira, pelas trevas, por tudo isso. O canal Hipócritas é como Porta dos Fundos. Tá? Assim como eles são subalternos à esquerda, hoje o canal Hipócritas é subalterno aos bolsopetistas. Aquilo que for necessário fazer para criar uma cortina de fumaça, uma realidade falsa e de estar próximo ao poder como uma mariposa cega que se debate na luz, é isso que eles vão fazer. Só que os seres humanos, eles não são fascinados pela luz, eles são fascinados pelas trevas. Estão sempre dispostos a cair mais. Vocês vejam que eles anularam, né, a quebra de sigilo do Flavinho Wonka. E hoje eles não querem mais só foro privilegiado, hoje eles querem o foro da impunidade. impunidade total. Vejam só aqui o mito falando a respeito do foro privilegiado antes de ser eleito.
Dos 503 deputados, 450 vão ser reeleitos. Porque eles têm que ser reeleitos. Para continuar com o foro privilegiado. O único prejudicado do foro privilegiado hoje sou eu. O prejudicado, eu não quero essa porcaria do foro privilegiado.
Agora você não quer. Mas o seu filho recorreu 11 vezes para tentar anular as provas que eram conclusivas no caso das rachadinhas. Conclusivas. E aí o senhor Noronha, lá no STJ, que já deu diversas decisões favoráveis a Bolsonaro, anulou a decisão de Itabaiana. Ao mesmo tempo que eles anulam provas lícitas, Cássio Nunes, colocado no Supremo Tribunal Federal pelo mito, dá à defesa do Lula a possibilidade de usar provas ilícitas, roubadas e adulteradas. O 100% aliado com Bolsonaro. Cadê que canal Hipócritas vai fazer alguma crítica em relação a isso? Porque eles são eles mesmos hipócritas, são vendidos ao poder. Se fascinam por estarem junto ao poder, mesmo que seja um corrupto, um réu, condenado como Roberto Jefferson. Ficam em júbilo de felicidade. A cretinice desses caras não tem limites. Ele correndo atrás de foro privilegiado loucamente. E aí o que acontece? O STJ anula. Ao mesmo tempo em que o STF, como eu falei, permite à defesa do Lula acesso a provas roubadas, ilegais e adulteradas. Ao mesmo tempo em que a Câmara, com o senhor Renan Calheiros e com os líderes do governo escolhidos por Jair Bolsonaro, Fernando Bezerra, que foi ministro da Dilma, Ricardo Barros, envolvido em todo tipo de sacanagem que você pode imaginar, estava junto com a Dilma também, e Eduardo Gomes, que entrou na política por Renan Calheiros, e o próprio Renan Calheiros, tentam criminalizar, anistiar os hackers que roubaram as mensagens e colocar por trás das grades na cadeia Sérgio Moro, Deltan Dallagnol e toda a força-tarefa da Lava Jato. Como o próprio ministro Fachin falou, a Lava Jato ela é perseguida pelos seus acertos e não pelos seus erros. Eles ficam atrás de pelo em ovo para tentar anular tudo e para que prospere o acordão pela impunidade absoluta. Mas a era da impunidade absoluta, ela está para chegar hoje, inclusive. Como eu disse, a toque de caixa, o senhor Arthur Lira vota pelo foro da impunidade absoluta, não é mais nem foro privilegiado. Para você ter uma ideia, este foro pela impunidade absoluta faria com que aquela que é acusada de matar o próprio marido, a Flor de Lis, fosse solta, ficasse livre, leve e solta. É a tranquilidade absoluta para aqueles políticos fichas sujas delinquirem à vontade. É a tranquilidade absoluta para que todos esses caras que nos assaltam desde a época de Cabral jamais sintam o peso da justiça. Arthur Lira diz o seguinte, que essa não é a PEC da impunidade, não. Ele mesmo que enforcou a mulher, que é réu 2 vezes. Né? E adivinhe quem é que votou pela essa PEC da impunidade? O Eduardo Bolsonaro, ou Bananinha, pensando em blindar totalmente a sua família. E quando é que você vai ver estes tetolas aqui do canal Hipócritas fazendo algum humorzinho a respeito disso? Olha lá, as cenas até pulam aqui, ó. Humor de vendidos. Não, eles vão lá e debocham daquelas pessoas que foram às ruas procurar um pouco de justiça, que foram se manifestar. Se decepção matasse com esses caras aqui. Cadê que eles falam a respeito da PEC da impunidade? Cadê que eles falam a respeito de Cássio Nunes, que vota junto com o senhor Gilmar Mendes e com o senhor Lewandowski, que foi colocado lá pelo mito? Cadê que eles falam do PGR, que colocou o Daniel Silveira na cadeia, que pediu, inclusive, né, apresentou a denúncia contra o Daniel Silveira? Não. Porque para eles é interessante criar a cortina de fumaça. É interessante vender para você a farsa, o xadrez 4D. Eu digo a vocês, se o povo não acordar e acordar imensamente, nós vamos cair num buraco profundo, sem fim. É o país indo para isso. Tente despertar a pessoa que está próxima a você. Compartilhe esse vídeo com as pessoas. Faça com que as pessoas entendam, por exemplo, a lista de traição do mito. Faça com que as pessoas compreendam aquilo que está acontecendo. Porque as pessoas estão cegas, não só pela idolatria, mas pela cortina de fumaça criada por esses caras aqui. A Bárgada, canal Hipócritas e tudo mais. E quando perguntam para a tranqueira do mito por que para ele comentar a respeito do STJ ter anulado a quebra de sigilo do seu filho, Flavinho Monca, chocolateira lá.
Bolsonaro, presidente, qual a avaliação que o senhor fez da decisão do STJ ontem de derrubar a quebra dos sigilos fiscais?
Acabou a entrevista.
Acabou a entrevista aí, acabou a entrevista.
De derrubar a quebra dos sigilos fiscais.
Acabou a entrevista.
Acabou a entrevista aí, acabou a entrevista aí, acabou a entrevista. Covarde, covarde. Cadê que tem um videozinho de humor do Hipócritas falando a respeito disso? Vocês são hipócritas. Vocês são hipócritas, vocês me dão nojo. Vocês me dão nojo. Eu tenho nojo. De sempre querer se dar bem, sempre estar querendo atrás do outro, que nem vocês. Cara, é nojento. Fala aí de hipócritas. Pô, divulga nosso vídeo aí. Fala aí da...
Can't hear shit.
Bolsonaro, presidente, qual a avaliação que o senhor fez da decisão do STJ ontem de derrubar a quebra dos sigilos fiscais?
Acabou a entrevista.
Obrigado, presidente.
Agradecemos a participação de todos. Está encerrada esta coletiva de imprensa.
A gente, esse Augusto aí, toda hora aqui. É o que dá mais, né? É o que dá mais view, é o que dá mais like pra você, né? Então, cara, quando essa popularidade desse mito cair, quando as pessoas acordarem para isso que está acontecendo, porque se a Dilma tivesse feito 1% disso, se a quadrilha petista, se a anta da Dilma tivesse feito 1% que esse mito está fazendo, o povo estava lá na frente de Brasília com os carros estacionados ali, buzinando sem parar até um cara desses cair. Agora, como as pessoas estão abobadas, né, que nem jumentos ali, sem enxergar a realidade, com as cortinas de fumaças criadas pela Gadolândia, sem parar, Bergado, Terça Livre, Bárgada, canal Hipócritas e tal, aí o mito continua a sua brincadeira. E é o seguinte, bicho, o perigo de um cara desse, quando estiver caindo, tentar um golpe de Estado é real. É real. Como ele tentou em abril do ano passado. Acabou, chega de velha política. Chega de velha política, tá ok? Porque ele não vai se desprender do poder tão cedo, não. Então é o seguinte, desculpe aí. Vocês acordem, vocês compartilhem esse vídeo, vocês comecem a brigar por despertar as pessoas, por tirar as mariposas abobadas da lâmpada na qual elas se batem. Lutem por isso. Porque o país inteiro está à beira do precipício. Enquanto nós somos dirigidos por esses hipócritas sem vergonhas aqui. Rindo da nossa cara junto com o mensaleiro.
Ninguém mais maluco. Não foi isso. Ninguém mais maluco.
Estão rindo da sua cara. Estão rindo da sua cara. Da minha cara também. Verifique a inscrição no canal, o gostinha e o chininho. Quando tiver força, nós seremos os últimos a estar de pé no mar de mentira, no mar de canalice, no mar de imundice que se tornou nosso país. Nós ficaremos, enquanto existir forças, de pé. Ir mesmo, não nos faz o dia inteiro, entendeu? A vida humana humana sendo desobjetivo, né? Qual o seu objetivo disso tudo, do canal e tal? O dia inteiro, o dia inteiro, o dia inteiro. E aí o dinheiro pra bombar mais as contas dessas pessoas. Tu acha que tatuou o ligumo por quê? Porra, cara, isso aí todo mundo comenta, dá view, tá o assunto mais comentado da semana. A mulher tatuou o ligumo, retocou, rebostou a tatuagem no ligumo. O meu sogro esses dias chegou pra mim e ele ficou muito... ele não concorda assim com as minhas atitudes aqui, né? Fala, eu vejo muita raiva nos seus vídeos, o seu linguajar, às vezes você espanta as pessoas do seu canal, pessoas que poderiam estar ouvindo alguma coisa edificante. Eu vejo que você quer edificar as pessoas, tal. Eu não concordo com a linguagem que você está utilizando. Qual é o seu objetivo, né? Qual é o seu objetivo disso tudo do canal, tal? Eu parei para pensar e eu dei uma resposta que é a sinceridade. O que eu quero? Qual é o meu objetivo com esse canal? Eu quero destruir tudo. Eu quero destruir tudo. Aquilo que eu sinto é o ódio mais puro, mais cristalino por este mundo aqui. Destruir tudo mesmo, entendeu? Porque não tem jeito, brother. Não tem como você conviver com tanta corrupção, não tem como você conviver com tanta nojeira, não tem como você conviver com as relações humanas jogadas na lama, jogadas... como as pessoas chafurdando como bestas, como animais o dia inteiro, entendeu? A vida humana sendo desrespeitada toda hora, a todo momento, por gente que inclusive se diz ser conservadora e não é. Aquela esperança que nós tínhamos em 2018 de ter um Brasil um pouco melhor, vocês lembram lá, eu comemorando, feliz, tal, a luz no final do túnel era um trem. A luz no fim do túnel era um trem. É destruir mesmo. Não vos conformeis com o mundo. Não dá para se conformar com isso daqui, cara. Como eu disse no começo do vídeo, o apocalipse deixou de ser um temor para se tornar uma esperança por esse mundo. Porque se não se consome tudo nos fogo mesmo, não tem jeito, cara. Olha isso daqui. As pessoas estão virando bestas, bestializadas. Então não dá pra você tapar o sol com a peneira. Os dois assuntos mais comentados da semana são esses. Não é a destruição da Petrobras não, meu amigo. Não é as canalices que são feitas no governo, não. Não é a CPMF dos governadores, não é nada disso. Os assuntos mais comentados são uma mulher com o ligume estufado pra cima e o cara tatuando, e uma outra que levou 99% de rejeição de um povo abobado que assiste essa porcaria. É isso aí. É isso aí. Tá? Então este aí foi o vídeo de hoje. É só um desabafo mesmo.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh god.
So, well, first of all, when we interview people, we do ask for some evidence of exceptional ability, which in most cases includes innovation. This is not to say that everyone needs to be innovative, but we certainly need those that are doing advanced engineering to be innovative. And ideally everyone is at least to some degree innovative. So at the interview point, we select for people who want to create new technology, and then the incentive structure is set up such that innovation is rewarded. Making mistakes along the way does not come with a big penalty, but failure to try to innovate at all comes with a big penalty. You'll be fired. If you don't even try, or somebody doesn't even try to innovate, or their innovation aspirations are not very good, then yeah, they will no longer do something. So I want to make sure Tesla recruiting does does not have anything that says requires university, because that's absurd.
Oh.
But there is a requirement of evidence of exceptional ability. Like you just can't, if you try to do something exceptional, you must have evidence of exceptional ability. I don't consider going to college
No.
evidence of exceptional ability.
Go back.
In fact,
No.
ideally you dropped out and did something. I mean, obviously, look at like, Gates is a pretty smart guy. He dropped out.
Oh, I
Jobs is
see.
smart. He dropped out. Larry Ellison,
I
smart guy.
see.
He dropped out. Like, obviously not needed. So, did Shakespeare even go to college? Probably not. I mean, first of all, you don't need college to learn stuff. Okay, everything is available basically for free. You can learn anything you want for free. It is not a question of learning. There is a value that colleges have, which is like, seeing whether can somebody work hard at something, including a bunch of sort of annoying homework assignments, and still do their homework assignments, and kind of soldier through and get it done. That's like the main value of college. And then also, if you probably want to hang around with a bunch of people your own age for a while instead of going right into the workforce. So I think colleges are basically for fun and to prove you can do your chores, but they're not for learning.
4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, and we're live. 12 rules for life. So without reading this, so what you're saying is, that's what I like.
There's only 12 things you need to know in life, right? That's it?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
This interview that you just did with this woman, Kathy Newman, was that in the UK?
It was Channel 4, UK.
I just went, I felt bad, but I was also laughing. I went to her Twitter page to read, with each one of her tweets, no matter what she says, someone writes underneath it, so what you're saying is, and then some ridiculous, but, by the way,
can I do
your
shit?
fans were mocking
Wait.
her, but politely, non-aggressively. I didn't read any rude things. Like there was no insults, or maybe a few insults, but there's no swears. It was just playful.
Oh, I
mocking
get it.
Of the interview that she did with you, because the interview was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous interview. I mean, I listened to it or watched it
I need
several
to
times.
break
I was
the
like, this is
pin.
so strange. Like
If it
her
comes here,
determination to turn
you
it into
take
a
this over
conflict.
here.
It's one of the issues that I have with television shows.
Yeah.
Because they have a very limited amount of time, and they're trying to make things as salacious as possible. They want to have these sound bites, these clickbait sound bites, and she just went into it incredibly confrontational, not trying to find your actual perspective, but trying to force you to defend a non-realistic perspective.
Yes, well, I was the hypothetical villain of her imagination, essentially. Well, what happened was interesting, too, the way it played itself out, because
Should I
met
take
her in
it?
the green room
No.
beforehand. She was being made up, and then put a little bit of powder on me, and we had a friendly kind of interchange, and then we went and sat in front of the cameras, and for a couple of minutes, before the show got rolling, and we had a pretty pleasant back and forth, and then as soon as the cameras went on, she was a completely different person. And I thought, oh, I see what's going on. Yeah, well, so that kind of alerted me to, the fact that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark, let's say. Yeah, but, this is also why YouTube is going to kill TV. Because television, by its nature, all of these narrow broadcast technologies,
Oh, I'm black.
they rely on forcing the story, right? Because it has to happen now. It has to happen often in 5 minutes, because they only broadcast 5 minutes of that interview. They did put the whole thing up on YouTube.
To their credit,
It hasn't ceased to amaze me yet. I think that they thought that the interview went fine. That's the scuttlebutt I've got from sort of behind the scenes, because I know some people who know what's going on at Channel 4, and they're shell-shocked by the response. And then of course there was
Why?
the counter-response.
Oh.
The Guardian the next day published an article saying that the head of Channel 4 had to call in police security because of threats. Well, first of all, you can call the police in about anything, and they never did detail out exactly what the threats were. But then about 20 newspapers picked that up and went for the well, Kathy Newman is now being harassed by an army of online trolls for doing nothing but doing her job, which, well, and then there was a backlash against that in the press.
Isn't it the same thing though?
Well, what do you say
someone
about
took
that?
an
No.
audit of
Why
the
not?
actual interchanges that
If I put this
between
here.
fans and her, and there was way more negative ones coming your way.
Yes. That were
What do I
seriously negative.
accomplish?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
seriously
Yeah.
negative, violent, harassing, just rude. There were way more.
Yeah.
And no one picked up on that at all. It
Yeah.
was all, the narrative was she's a victim,
Yeah.
even though she was highly aggressive in this. But I
She's
don't
a
like
funny
to-
victim. It's not like
Yeah.
she's not successful.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Well,
like
that
at
was
some
what was
point you
interesting.
think you should have to
Yeah.
hand in your victim card.
That does make
I think
sense.
like when you go to an Ivy League university, it's like right then and there. You
gotta
get to hand
hand it
in. Yeah, because you don't get
Yeah,
to be
this is the
oppressor
last
and
one,
oppressed
probably.
at the same time. That's just too much.
Well, one of the things that you pointed out was when you were talking about competition for very lucrative jobs, and you were saying, "Look what you've done. Like
Oh.
you must have had to work here." And she proudly was saying how hard she had to work
Yeah.
to get there. I'm like, well, yes, of course. No one's going to hand this to you.
No,
This is
definitely
why,
not.
and this is why you were saying you are opposed
Oh, I
to
see.
equality of outcome.
Quality of outcome. I can't imagine anything we could possibly strive for in our society that would make it into hell faster than equality of outcome. Like the historical evidence for the pathology of that route is so strong. It's like you have to be historically ignorant beyond belief, or malevolent, or resentful beyond comprehension in order to think that that's a good idea. I argue for that.
I agree with you, but I think that even if you came into this with no knowledge of history, but a complete understanding of human beings, you would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And one of the best quotes that I've ever read about it is that if you have real, true freedom, you're never going to have equality of outcome. Because with real, true freedom, you have the freedom to not
To differ.
engage. Well, look, if you look at a guy like Jeff Bezos, for instance, that Amazon guy is worth more money than anybody ever, right? That guy works all day.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a maniac.
Oh, yeah.
He's acquiring all these different companies, and everything he's doing is designed to succeed.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just
Well, that's what Gates
fanatical
just
about
said
it.
too
Yes.
in a recent interview, and I know some guys that are, they're in approximately the same universe as those two, and they just work all the time.
That's all they do.
the time,
Yeah.
and they don't just work; they work so efficiently and so effectively, and make use of every second in ways you can't even imagine unless you're in that sort of position. So, and doing that doesn't mean that you will succeed, but not doing it certainly means that you will fail.
Well, not doing it certainly means you will never achieve that level of success, and that's
Now
what
that
we're
was
talking about.
easy.
We're talking about equality of outcome.
Yeah.
I don't want that. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to work like that. I don't want to do what he's doing, and I should have the freedom to not do that.
Yeah.
As he should have the freedom to do that. If we're going to play this game called capitalism, which we're all agreeing is probably, at least in as far as the models that we have right
How
now,
do I
is
make
the best
the
one that we have.
analysis
If
of
we're all
the
going to
game?
play this game, if someone decides to be the Michael Jordan of capitalism, you can't stop them. You can't say, no, you're playing this game too well. You're playing this game too hard. You're too obsessed with this game. You're going to have that.
Yeah, you can stop them. You can try to stop people from winning crookedly,
Yes.
which is what you should do. And,
Yes.
there's a couple of things that are really worth delving into with regards to that, too, because there's this sort of Marxist notion that all this inequality is generated as a consequence of capitalism. And that's actually technically false. Because if you look at, there seems to be something like a law of nature that's described by this statistical model called the Pareto Distribution. And it basically suggests that in any creative domain, there's going to be a small number of people will do almost all of the output. But it doesn't just apply to human beings. It applies to the heights of trees in the Amazon rainforest. It applies to the size of cities, and it applies to the mass of stars, and it's something like the more you have, the more you get. It's something like, you can imagine how that would work with a star. As it gets bigger and bigger and its gravitational mass increases, it's going to attract more and more matter. And then as a city grows, well, more and more people are excited to move there because of all the opportunities, and so some cities start to grow tremendously and others don't. But this phenomena where a small number of people end up controlling a tremendous proportion of the resource is not only limited to money, and it doesn't only occur in capitalist societies. It occurs everywhere. It's like a natural law. So you see the same thing with number of points scored by a spectacular sports figure. there's always a tiny proportion of people who are way ahead on the curve, or people who make records, or people who sell paintings, or people who compose music, or people who sell music online. It's all the same. It's the 1% gets 80%. And so, well, first, we can't blame that on capitalism. And second, we should note that it actually does constitute a problem, which is what the left-wingers are always jumping up and down about, right? Like, too much inequality starts to destabilize your society. And it isn't obvious how to shovel money from the top end, maybe the 1/10 of 1% who have almost all the money, down to the people who have almost nothing, in a way that's effective, so that they don't get thrown out of the game completely, and so that the whole society doesn't destabilize. We don't exactly know how to do that. It is a problem, because inequality does exist, and it does tend to magnify across time. And then there's another problem, too, which we haven't figured out, is imagine that in order to make everyone rich, you have to tolerate a certain amount of inequality. It seems obvious. We don't know how many units of inequality you need to tolerate per unit of wealth generated. But the answer is definitely not zero. It's definitely not zero. So...
Yeah, so it goes back to this equality of outcome idea.
Yeah.
And this thing has perplexed me since I've met you, and since you were involved in this original debate over gender pronouns. And there was an article that was written recently. I forget the exact title of it. I think it was something along the lines of "Why can't people hear what Jordan Peterson is saying?"
He fucked up.
You are misrepresented more than anyone I know, in a weird way. You are villainized in a weird way, where I can't believe that these people are honestly looking at your opinions and coming up with these conclusions. I can't help but feel like what is happening is people are consciously deciding to ignore reality and paint you as this archetypal figure of oppressive white male patriarchy, ignorance, fill in the blank with all the rest of the descriptives that you'd like to use. But they've decided to paint you in this way, like as a target, because they need a target to sort of reinforce this idea that transgender people are being victimized and women are being victimized. And
even deeper, that the right narrative is the way that we should view the world is victim versus oppressor, because that's the basic postmodern neo-Marxist template. It's the right way to view the world is that it's a power ground. It's a battleground of power interests competing constantly. The ones that win are oppressors. The ones that lose are oppressed. That's the way you look at the world. And I think that that's wrong. That's a bad way of looking at the world, psychologically, sociologically, politically, economically, ideologically, you name it. It ends in nothing but catastrophe. I mean, first of all, because it puts your group identity as something that's paramount. And I mean, that's just not, well, that isn't what we do in the West, let's say. We put your individual identity paramount. And then, well, that's just for starters, fundamentally. And then I guess the other reason that people are on my case to some degree is because I have made a strong case, which I think is fully documented by the scientific literature, that there are intrinsic differences, say, between men and women. And I think the evidence in that, this is the thing that staggered me, is that no serious scientists have debated that for like 4 decades. That argument was done by the time I went to graduate school. Everyone knew that human beings were not a blank slate, that biological forces not parameterized the way that we thought and felt and acted and valued. Everyone knew that. The fact that this has become somehow debatable again is just, especially because it's being done by legislative fiat, they're forcing it. To me, as a scientist, it's just well, and in the States too, with Title IX, for example, because Title IX is sort of predicated on that viewpoint.
What is Title IX?
Oh, Title IX was originally just a piece of legislation that mandated that female sports teams were funded to the same degree that male sports teams were funded in the American universities, but it's been expanded out so that if there's any differences in any areas whatsoever between the genders, then the universities are being taken to court. And like 200 of them, I mean, last I looked, about 200 of them were up, and they can have their funding revoked if they violate Title IX provisions. So it's become like a vicious weapon for social justice warrior, equality of outcome.
Now, how long will it take for him to...
sports. No, it's got way beyond that.
He should have gone here, so I could not take. I would need to run. That's
There was an article that I
okay.
sent you. One of them was from, I think, I got it off of dig.com, but it was Jordan Peterson is having his moment and we should ignore him. And I sent this to you, and there was one, a part
Probably, hey, the last part of that might be true.
but one of the things in the article was citing this study that showed
you cannot
very
take.
little difference
Oh, yeah,
Ooh.
I read that damn study.
Yeah.
Oh, God, it's a
I
pathetic
can
study.
take.
Yeah,
Well,
I sent it to you because I was like, this is not right.
Well,
Ah.
the thing is, like most things, it's complicated.
Smart.
You know, so
I
are
should
men
have
and
done
women
here
more
so he
similar
can take the
or more
horse.
different? Well, it depends on how you define the terms first.
Here?
But they're more
Here?
similar. Well,
No,
why? Well,
not
they're the
this.
same
Here.
species. So we could start with that.
Here.
Like, but the question is, what are the differences and how do they manifest themselves, and are those manifestations important? So here's an example. If you took a random woman out of the population and a random man, and you had to bet on who was more temperamentally aggressive, if you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. But you'd be wrong 40% of the time, and that's not a walloping difference, right? 60-40. It's not 90-10. Like, so there's a lot of overlap between men and women in terms of their levels of aggression. And you think, well, they're more the same. Yeah, except. So then let's say, no, let's play a slightly different game. Let's pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person from the random population. Well, they're all men. And that's why all the people in prison are men. So even though, on average, men and women, well, yeah, it's 90 to 95%, right? So, and often if the women are
I
because they got
lost.
taken up with a
Let's
really
stop
bad
dragging
guy,
this shit.
You know, so
Rematch.
one of the problems is that differences at the extreme are where the differences really start to manifest themselves. And so you can have a small difference at the level of the average, but out at the extremes, it starts to make a massive difference. So let's say to be a Google engineer, which is hard, right? Because you not only have to be an engineer, but you have to be a very good engineer. Say, well, you have to be interested in things rather than people. That's a huge difference in interest. Like, men are more interested in things, generally speaking, and women are more interested in people, generally speaking. Now, there's still a lot of overlap between them, but that's one of the biggest differences between men and women. It's been demonstrated cross-culturally. It's also a very big difference in the Scandinavian countries. Well,
Almost made
on average,
an
the difference isn't that
oopsie.
great, even though it's a relatively large difference. But at the extremes, it's the same thing. Almost all the people who are hyper focused on things, they're almost all men. And all the people who are hyper-focused on people are almost all women. And so how does that play out in the world? Well, in the Scandinavian countries, it plays out this way. About 85% of nurses in Scandinavia
I
are
kinda
female.
self-locked
and about
myself
85
here.
to 90% of engineers are male. It doesn't mean women can't be engineers. It doesn't mean men can't be nurses. It also doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. But it does have to do with interest, and the differences in interest are big. Now, at the extremes in particular. So when you read a review like that, the one that was pointed out, the first question is, well,
Yank.
what do you mean by big and little? There's more overlap. There's more overlap between men and women than there is difference on virtually every parameter. Okay, fine. Are the remaining differences significant in how they play out in the world? And the answer to that is overwhelmingly significant, because you select for extremes. So here's another example. Ashkenazi Jews have an average IQ of 115. So in the typical population overall has an average IQ of 100. 15 points is about the difference between the typical college
Oh,
student
shit,
and the
this
typical
one.
high school student. Okay, so it's not a massive difference, but if you go to the extreme, say, well, let's go look at people who only have an IQ of 145, which is kind of where you hit the beginnings of genius level. It's like the Jews are overwhelmingly overrepresented. So relatively small differences in the average can produce walloping differences at the extremes. People don't understand that. It's not surprising, because it actually requires a fairly sophisticated grasp of statistics. But when we're talking about things like differential outcome in the workplace, then you have to take a sophisticated statistical approach to it, or you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And unfortunately, many of the people who are talking about things like gender differences, they have no idea what they're talking about. They don't know the literature. They don't know there is a literature. They don't understand biology, like the social constructionist types, the women's studies types, the neo-Marxists. They don't give a damn about biology. It's like they inhabit some disembodied universe. So the review was poorly written at best and did not showed a very poor grasp of the relationship between group differences and economic and practical outcomes.
It's not just that, it's deceptive. And there's a need in some way on that side, this side of the debate, the anti-Jordan Peterson side, to label men and women as being virtually identical when there's so much evidence that that's not the case. And what you're saying, what you've never said, one is superior, one is inferior. What you are is a guy who's pointing out the reality of the difference between the various types of human beings, and you've been very open about the extremes. About you, look, I'm well aware of the extremes. I deal with MMA fighters. I know a lot of female MMA fighters. They're as aggressive and as tough as any man you're ever going to meet in your life. And I know a lot of men from comedy that are meek little guys who they're not nearly as aggressive as some of these female fighters. Look, I think one of the beautiful things about freedom is that people get an opportunity to express themselves in a way that's genuinely them.
Yep.
And whether that is like our friend Alex Honnold, who's a free climber, who's like climbing up these fantastic mountains with no ropes, or whether it's a female MMA fighter like Raquel Pennington, who's just a tank and beating the shit out of people, and that's what she loves to do. All of these extremes are available to people because of freedom. This is not a suppressive thing. No one's stopping people from choosing these paths. I don't know if you saw the most recent slip-up by the CEO of YouTube.
Why is this play good? This is good.
They were talking about
but then I
why
take
there's not as many women in tech. And
so
she basically
if he
said
plays
they both,
this,
her and the
I play
CEO of
this.
Google, said
Then
exactly
what?
James Damore was saying in his memo. They completely fucked up. They tried to... Look, did you find this? Look at this. This is goddamn hilarious. James Damore had this on his page.
If I put this,
They respond
he
to women a lack of
I
integrity.
take.
No, go to James
Oh
Damore's tweet.
shit!
Just go to the what I
I would trade
retweeted,
a queen for a
what
queen.
he said.
So there was a study published a while ago about
No, Jamie, scroll back up. It was right there. It's right there. Just make his tweet larger. There you go. Look, see, it said, he's saying, did I read this right? I don't know how to say her name. Is Susan Wojcicki? I'm sorry, I don't know how to say her name. Wojcicki said that women find geeky male industries, as opposed to social industries, not very interesting, and Sundar cites research on gender differences.
That's exactly the difference in interest that I just pointed out.
Yes,
That's exactly right.
This is what James Damore wrote in his memo that got him fired. And this, in my mind, if I was the lawyer for James Damore, I'd be like, oh, well, look what we have here. This is checkmate.
Yeah.
You dummies. You just said what he said.
The Damore story is really interesting, because I think it's such a classic story of an engineer getting tangled up in politics. So Damore went to this diversity seminar, and he wasn't very happy about it because he knew the literature. And so at the end of the seminar, they asked for feedback. Well, James Damore is an engineer. So when you tell an engineer that you want feedback, the engineer thinks, oh, you want feedback, and you want, like, facts and stuff, right? Because that's what feedback would be like. So Damore went and wrote this, like, thorough memo and gave it to them. He said, well, this is what I think. Here's some feedback. And then it traveled around. He got no real response from the diversity people, and then he posted it on one of these internal boards at Google where people can discuss things, which people at Google do all the time. So it was perfectly reasonable for him to post it because he didn't get a response from the diversity people. He thought, well, let's see what other people think. And then it was there for a long time until it was leaked up into the outside world. It wasn't like Damore was trying to expose Google for what it is. He was just doing what an engineer type would do when someone asked him to provide feedback, because he's not thinking politically. He's not thinking, oh, they just want to hear what they already said. He thought they actually wanted some facts. Anyways, I think they picked on the wrong guy, because Damore turns out to be pretty damn tough.
Well, he's very smart and a very kind guy. When you sit down and talk to him, he's not a sexist. He's a guy that's talking about facts. In fact, he wrote more than a page and a half, I believe, on strategies for getting more women interested in tech. He's not a sexist. This is just a guy that was talking about the differences and the choices that people make that's based on just the variations that you were just discussing.
Well, there's a good study done a while ago, and unfortunately I don't remember the author, but they were looking at junior high math prodigies, and they're pretty equally distributed between boys and girls. But by the time university came along, the math prodigy boys, they tend to go into the STEM fields, but the girls wouldn't. And it isn't because they lacked ability, because they had stellar ability. It's because they weren't interested. And it turns out, like the interest thing turns out to be a big one. So with personality alone, if you measure men and women's personalities, and then you add up all the differences in personalities, you could tell with about 75 to 80% certainty by looking at a full personality readout whether a person's male or female. So you'd be wrong 25% of the time, something like that. But if you add interest to that, you can get it up to about 90%. And so, you know, you say, well, are these differences large? Well, individually they're not that big. They make more difference at the extremes. But if you add them up,
Now he can take this.
then you can almost completely differentiate men from women. So by that token, they're very large. And the interest thing
trade
actually
a
turns
pawn
out to
for a
matter a lot.
bishop.
Like it's probably the most important individual
So
difference
far,
that
so
we discovered
good.
between men and women at the psychological level. And has
I'm
real
scared
decent
what this
explanatory
bitch
power,
can
because
do.
you might say, well, men have a slight edge in spatial
I
intelligence,
can block
and that's
her.
why they're overrepresented in STEM fields. And women have a slight edge in verbal intelligence. This is debatable, but the literature kind of indicates that, and that's why they're overwhelmingly the majority of fiction readers, for example. Is that the reason that there's differential representation in the STEM fields? It's like, no, it doesn't seem to be. It doesn't look like it's an intellectual issue, which is also what Damore pointed out, by the way. He never
He
said
runs
once that this was a
the
cognitive issue.
fuck out of
But
here,
it's a matter of choice,
or he
a matter of
trades.
interest. And women tend to be more
I think he will
more
trade.
people-oriented. Now, the thing is, this is also being discovered in chimpanzees and other primates. Like if you offer baby or child chimpanzees, juvenile chimpanzees, the choice between thing-like toys, like cars, or people-like toys, like dolls, the males will go for the thing-like toys and the females will go for the people-like toys. So you see that in primates. And you think, well, is that surprising? It's like, well, no, it's not that surprising, really. I mean, women have to take care of infants, tiny infants, and you have to be really people-oriented to do that, because a tiny infant is an unbelievably demanding social relationship, and it's a primary relationship for about 2 years, you know, and so women are tilted towards the kind of temperament that
He
makes
takes
that
and
possible.
lose.
It's like, well, is that such a shock? Really? That's such a surprise? So,
No,
yeah.
it's not a surprise. And what's confusing to me
A pawn.
is the narrative that anybody that points out these differences is somehow a sexist or discriminatory or worse.
Yeah. Well, whatever epithet they can. Well, I think the other reason that the left, the radical lefties, have been going after me constantly is, well, there's one reason is if you stand up against the radical left, you're in a group that also has Nazis in it, because the Nazis also stand up against the radical left. So it's perfectly reasonable from a strategic perspective for the radical leftists to say, well, you're against us, how do we know you're not a Nazi? It's like, well, statistically I'm probably not, you know, so there's that. But you could say at least the question is open. But then the next part of it comes is that it's motivated epithet slinging, because if I'm reasonable and I'm standing up against the radical left, and they admit that I'm reasonable, then there has to be an admission
What
that
could you do to
reasonable
improve you?
people could stand up against the radical left, which kind of implies that the radical left isn't that reasonable. And so, well, they're not going to go there. Of course, they're not that reasonable. They're unreasonable beyond belief, as we saw in the situation with Lindsay Shepherd in Canada. So at Wilfrid Laurier University.
Let's talk about that real quick, because that was a fascinating thing too, and that also had to do with you. So she was discussing you in class, and you fill in everybody with...
Yeah, she's in the communications department at Wilfrid Laurier, and they were talking about the role of language in communication, which is kind of what you would do in a communication class. And she decided to show a 5-minute clip from a program I had done for TV Ontario, which is a public television station, mainstream, left-leaning, liberal television station, news program, and a good one. And I had been on there with a number of other people, including Professor Nicholas Matt from the University of Toronto, who claimed essentially that there were no biological differences between men and women, and that had been the scientific consensus for the last 4 decades.
Okay.
So anyways, she showed a clip from this, and, well, she got hauled in front of 2 professors and an administrator, Adria Joel, who was basically hired for that purpose, and raked over the coals for daring to show this video. And she had the wherewithal to tape it. And then she made the tape public, and in that tape they compared me. It was really blackly comical, you know. They compared me to Hitler, but then said, well, it's Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. I thought, you guys, you're so damn clueless, you can't even get your insults right. It's like, you can't say, that's like playing a video of Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. It's like, first of all, Hitler and Milo Yiannopoulos, they're actually not in the same category, right? Except that they're both human. That's about the narrowness of the category. And then Milo's like a comic provocateur, and you can hate him or love him or be indifferent. But to put him in the same category as Hitler just shows how muddle-headed you are. And then to assimilate me to that category so carelessly, like, you don't mess about with epithets like that. You know, Hitler was one of the great supervillains of the 20th century, right? I mean, he's up there with Stalin and Mao in the panoply of satanically possessed leaders. You don't just toss that around, especially not when you're torturing your teaching assistant for daring to show a video about language in a communication class. And so that was a massive scandal in Canada. It was the biggest, I think it was the biggest scandal that ever hit a university in Canada. And it got a lot of international attention, and rightly so. And she also turns out to be a